So do you think maybe there's an implication here where Paul is telling us that God has designed the husband to be the one who is responsible for the spiritual preservation, so to speak, of the family? Does that seem kind of plausible? And I think we'll see that idea of deliverance in every aspect of authority as we go down and look at these. So kind of keep that in mind. But I think that's important because I think we'll see that theme kind of continue. And so he continues in verse 24, but as the church is subject to Christ, so also the wives ought to be to their husbands in everything. And so as it's been pointed out, it's very clear that Paul is using this relationship as a parallel to Christ being the groom, the church being the bride, and that being a marriage. And so he jumps then to husbands. And notice he doesn't say, husbands, be subject to your wives, but he says, love your wives. So I've got a question. Is there subjection in love? Yes, I mean, he doesn't use the word be subject to your wife, but he's already, again, kind of speaking to that order. He's put the husband as the head. He is designed to be the spiritual leader, the spiritual preserver, so to speak, of the family. But he uses the word love your wives. And we ought to know, because he says, just as Christ loved the church and did what? Gave himself up for her. I mean, that was the ultimate example of subjection, wasn't it? Of subjecting himself to the body. And so there's absolutely subjection on the husband's part, isn't there, in the relationship? You've got to subject yourself to the needs of the wife, but he's not saying subject yourselves in the way that now we reverse the order back, and now he's not reversing the order of now placing the wife in the role as a spiritual leader, although she's going to be a leader if there's children. Brandon?
I think too it's interesting to think about the wisdom that the Spirit has given Paul here. You know, men, I think, in a general rule, crave to be needed as a leader and a provider, and women, in a general rule, crave love. Parents appreciate highly their children's obedience. And it's interesting to think about not only how this is wise, but it's God's design for things. You know, that he has created us, you know, mankind, men and women, kids, a certain way that goes along with his design of the church, the design of the world. And, you know, it just kind of speaks to, you know, his overarching greatness, you know.
Yep. Scott? And then Eric?
I don't want to throw a wrench into it, but I mean, I agree 100% with the whole idea of you know, God has patterned this in a certain way, and God is the one in charge and ultimate and all of that. But part of this too I think has to do with what man has done in the garden, and specifically the woman. Okay, when it came to the curse for the husband, she's going to desire her husband and to rule over. Now a husband can rule over wrongly. Okay, he didn't tell the husband to rule over in a bad way, but I think that pattern, it fits here, and I think that's part of this whole pattern that runs in here. Okay.
No, I would agree.
Yeah.
Was there another, Eric, did you have?
Yeah, I think there's maybe this doesn't apply, I don't know, but there's a really good, Matthew's got a real good parable Jesus talks about. It's the vineyard, the workers in the vineyard, and he talks about these people that are the first to come and work the vineyard. and then they hire some in the 11th hour and then some at the end, and they all get paid the same amount. But the people that he hired first, the people that were first, were bitter about not getting more money than the people that only worked an hour. And Jesus proclaims at the end of it, he says, the last will be first. And so we got to be, when we read this about the women, and try to put them in that stack rank order out there, we got to understand that the same reward is out there for all of us. God looks at us the same. We have the same reward waiting on us, whether we're a man or a woman.
Yeah, and I wouldn't even begin to compare, I guess, in my estimation thing, I wouldn't begin to compare responsibilities because I think they're, in whatever role that is, they're going to be the same across the board. So yeah, any other thoughts? He continues on in verse 26. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for. And we said there's lots of subjection there. But notice the reason, so that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with a word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she should be holy and blameless. So again, there's that parallel, I think, that goes back to the husband being the preserver, and that being a responsibility of his to live in such a way and behave in such a way and act in such a way and provide the example in such a way that lends to, that spiritual well-being in the family, whether it's the wife and the children. Any thoughts there? Okay, and he bases that on, he says, so he continues on, verse 28, so husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. He said no one ever hates his own flesh, but he nourishes it and cherishes it, like we talked about. And husbands, do you love your wives with that kind of love? I mean, that's a pretty important question to ask ourselves when we get to that point. And that's a high stand. That's the highest standard, as Christ loved the church. Obviously, we're not going to live up to perfection there. We deal with those paper cuts and even bigger injuries in our marriage, and sometimes we're just content to let them go. But whenever, like we talked about, you stub your toe and you realize your whole body can't get around as well as it should. It just throws everything off. We ought to see the body, if the members are one, just like Paul says that Christ did what he did because we're members of his body. If we see our spouses in that same relationship, then we're going to take, if there's a problem, we're going to take care of it so that we can bring that harmony and that melody back. There's no reason to let that fester and just allow it to go on and get worse. We ought to see it with that kind of parallel in mind. That, hey, I don't like this. This is hurting. I wish it would go away. And we need to deal with that in the same way in our relationships and be willing to communicate it and get it out and get it taken care of. Okay, and so the natural place really for Paul to go back and throw in a verse here is when he quotes Genesis 2:24, because he said, because we are members, Christ did what he did because we are members of his body, and he was nourishing and cherishing us when he did what he did. But Paul says, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and shall be joined to his wife, literally to be glued to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And so Paul said, this mystery is great. And he said, but I'm referencing Christ in the church. What do you think what do you make of that this mystery is great? What is Paul, any thoughts as to what he's saying here? Joe?
The mystery is just what he said. Two becoming one is a mystery.
Yeah.
If the magician puts two lions in a cage and then covers it up, or puts two babies in there and covers it up, and all of a sudden there's just one when he pulls it back, that's a mystery. We don't know how that. I mean, we're mystified by that, and I'm not
making that an exact parallel. But the mystery of becoming one flesh, it's been, I think too often we think of that just in the purely physical aspect, and that's really not where he's headed with that. He's giving the spiritual application that they really do become one in intent, one in the mission of raising godly children, one in the mission of showing God's care and God's love and the light of Jesus out of that one home. And it just becomes without using it's a team effort, but it's a team of two becoming one.
Yeah.
And it's the same way that Jesus and the church are one. He's our Redeemer. He's our head, but He made us the body so that we might go out and do the things that would glorify Him and advance the body. He gave us that great charge. And so in that sense, we're one with Christ, the church, but we're one in mission. And I think that's the mystery.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I didn't think of it from a perspective of the mystery being one, because we can't fathom that. We can't fathom two separate beings considering yourself. Well, that's why it's so difficult for us. And I think even from looking at it from that perspective, when you go back in the garden, when God causes this first relationship to take place, it was foreshadowing even then what was going to take place much years later. I was looking at some commentaries, and I've come to really appreciate John Gill and some of the comments he makes. And if you go to Bible Hub, he's one of the ones that always shows up on the commentaries. And back in the 1700s is when he lived. But he brought up the point that just the whole aspect is there's so much depth in that one relationship and what it means to the church. He even brought up a point that when you go back to that verse that Paul quotes in Genesis 2:24 about the two becoming one flesh, and you just go right back before that in verses 21 through 23, it's where he talks about how God caused Adam to fall under the deep sleep, and he takes the rib and he fashions woman, and then he causes Adam to come back and to come awake, and the language is he brought Eve and presented him to Adam. And so he said he wasn't dogmatic about this, but he said that part of the mystery and the depth of this may be seen in the fact that God was going to cause his son to come and go into a deep sleep, so to speak. He was going to be put to death. But yet when he was arisen, he was presented his bride, the church. And I thought, wow, that's something I've certainly never seen, and it just adds another layer to something that is so deep, and how wise and amazing God is to plan all this and design all this a certain way.
Just a quick add-on to that, Jesus talks about that we will eat his flesh and drink his blood, and that he would make us brothers. That's how we're adopted into God's kingdom. Is that he's the righteousness that we trust in, and so, but we're the creation that he did it for. So there's a oneness of intent and purpose, not a oneness of we're never Jesus, but we strive to be like him in what we do. So it is a mystery that we become one with him by his death, burial, and resurrection, and us entering into that covenant with him. So there's a mystery still involved in that. How can I be righteous? Well, that's mysterious to me.
That's right. Yeah. It's all a great mystery. Yeah.
I think it's this whole paragraph is like an analogy with the church, but just like a man leaves his parents for a woman, for his wife, so too it's true as being a part of this church. We're not part of this world anymore, really. We leave this world and become one with his church. So he's making a reference there as well.
Yeah, that's another one. A lot of depth there in this parallel that we see. So let's move on to the children. I don't know if we'll have time to finish all these tonight, but what reasons are given that a child should honor or obey his parents? Okay, first it's right. It is right to do that. Pretty simple. What else does he say? It's the first commandment with a promise. Yeah, and that's an interesting. There's a lot of deep things in this lesson tonight. And when you think about that, he says it's the first commandment with a promise, and then he names the promise that you would let me get to that point here. Yeah, that you would live, and Paul translates it as you may live long on the earth, that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. When you go back to Exodus 20 where the Ten Commandments are given, how do we usually break up the Ten Commandments? We say there's really two categories there, isn't there? The first few, the first four probably are directed toward that relationship with God, to not take his name in vain, remember the Sabbath, make no idols and such, and then he goes to the other six really that start to deal with your fellow man. But that first one that deals with your fellow man is to honor your father and mother. And so it's being that first command on that lateral relationship, and that's of course what Paul is talking about. Back in chapter 4 he said we're going to speak truth to our neighbor. And so that's what he's dealing with from here on out. And so being that first command, it's where we really learn the foundation of how to treat our fellow man, isn't it? How we learn authority in general comes from that relationship with children to parents. Before we even really learn about authority to God, we learn authority to a mother and father. And so it's a very foundational relationship. Let's look back to Deuteronomy quickly. Deuteronomy chapter 31, and I think we'll see kind of an example of this. Deuteronomy 31, beginning in verse 9. Moses wrote the law, and he gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of the Israel. He's given them the law, and he commanded them, saying, at the end of every 7 years, at the time of the year of remission of debts, at the Feast of Booths, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place which he will choose, you shall read this law in front of all Israel in their hearing. Assemble the people, the men and the women, the children, the alien who is in your town, so that they may hear and learn and fear the Lord your God, and be careful to observe all the words of this law. The children who have not known will hear and learn to fear the Lord your God as long as you live on the land which you are about to cross the Jordan to possess. So there's that tie with living in the land, the children learning and obeying. And as Joshua, you'll remember, as we go into chapter 4, we won't take the time to look at that verse, but as they crossed, do you remember as they crossed, God told them to take 12 stones, and you go into the place where you're going to lodge that night, you build a memorial so that when your children ask, hey, what are these stones? You tell them about the deliverance, and you tell them about God parting the waters of the Jordan to give you the land. And as we know, God let them dwell in the land that he gave them until the disobedience was so, at a level where God said, I'm removing you from the land. And so I just see this command as very foundational to society in general. Because again, it's where we learn authority. It's where we learn to obey God. It's where we learn to obey or to submit ourselves to our brothers and sisters, or to love your neighbor. It all comes down to that relationship with the mother and father. So for young people, you're in a crucial time to where you need to understand that and to be soaking that in and learn that, because it causes a lot of problems when you don't understand that authority, because it's all about deliverance, and that's the key to kind of tying this back to deliverance. Even when we read Romans 13 and we're told to be subject to government, we're told that the government does not bear the sword for nothing, and it's a minister of God, an avenger of evil, to carry out God's wrath. So if we want deliverance from that, we need to learn to submit and obey, and be subject to authorities. And so it's not only crucial for the young people to be at a time where you realize the importance of that, of honoring your mother and father, but as Paul transitions to fathers, it's crucial for fathers to be able to provide that environment and not be a hindrance to where they can learn that as we'll see. So let's skip to that real quick. What does he mean when he tells fathers to not provoke a child to anger?
Hey, that kid does something you don't like, punch him in the nose. And I think we're seeing a lot of that. You know, you can turn on television and see that today. We are teaching kids exactly this, do this. I don't think it's a lesson on necessarily you got to be a great dad or whatever. I'm not a fan of that, but I think it's you know, you don't teach your kids to get revenge, to fight, to be mean, to do those kind of things. Don't provoke them to do things wrong.
Yeah, it's when he says to go ahead, Janie. Yeah, I think that's right. To anger, to provoke your child to wrath, it's the translation is to bring alongside with. So if a father is bringing along his child with him to wrath, that means he's dealing with them in a way that's not appropriate, isn't it? And it goes back to me in chapter 4, that command of be angry yet do not sin. You can be angry because there's sin amongst the body, or that you need to correct a child, but you don't treat them with the anger that just puts you right in there where you're guilty of the same thing. Marilyn?
And the New American Standard says, fathers, do not exasperate your children so that they may not lose heart.
Yeah, that's a great parallel. Yeah, because if you're putting them in that environment, you're not giving them a chance to learn authority. You're not giving them a chance to honor your mother and father, and kind of, creating that environment where they're able to learn that. And so you're really just both of you following a path. When you bring your child along with you to anger, you're walking right toward the anger and wrath of God, aren't you? And that's why the contrast is, but bring them up in the discipline and the fear of the Lord. You go there's two different ways here. You can go to the wrath of the Lord, or you can bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. Joe?
Yeah, Eric can speak to this as well. When you spend enough time in the jail, you realize that maybe 1 in 100 male inmates will mention their father. Almost always they were raised by a grandmother, secondarily by a mother. And it's just over and over again when you see the absence of that, you see, and I'm just doing this purely, not politically, but just purely carnally here, saying society breaks down when fathers don't do what God put them in there to do.
Yeah.
And then and the main point is God put you there, do it right. And do it like treat them like I would treat you. There's a gentleness involved, but it's also a sternness that says, okay, this is sin, this is wrong, but I still love you, and we're gonna move forward, and we're gonna conquer this together, rather than exasperating them as the other verse.
I think we're out of time, but one more question, and then I guess next week we'll pick up here. Do you think it's easier? I can say with 100% accuracy, I haven't always created that environment. Do you think it's easier to go talk to a brother or sister in love and gentleness and the ways, humility, and the ways that we're told to walk in? Do you think it's easier to go talk to a brother or sister that may need correction, or to do that with your child? Yeah, I don't know. I was kind of thinking backwards, and maybe I am. and here's where I'm coming from, I guess. And it's not easy. But when you're going to talk to a brother or sister, kind of going in that, okay, I need to be prepared for this. So I'm going to prepare myself to kind of, to approach it in a particular way. Whereas with a child, whether you're with them 24/7 and you've told them over and over and over, and then you finally just blow, and maybe that happens more than it should. So it's not an easy thing. Yeah, it's difficult, but just know we need to just know what the Scripture says and be praying for the Spirit to live in us and work in us. And so we walk by gentleness and humility and create that environment where they can learn the instruction.
And the other thing is
Lord.
we're growing, we're growing, especially as parents. You're young when you start out, and you're learning how to do this
Yeah,
junk.
that's right.
But if you keep Christ at the center of it, you're always gonna have the right intentions, and really that kind of goes along with what Joe says. I mean, as a young father, I was much more hot-headed and much more quick to anger, but I was also much more immature and much more unequipped, unwise. The older I've gotten, the better I've gotten, the better I've been more seasoned. I've had more experience. We always talk and joke about, Lauren was the guinea pig. She was the first one.
Mm-hmm.
She got more spankings than the other ones. I don't know if that's just because she was harder headed, or maybe that's because the other ones saw what she got and were like, I don't want that.
Yeah.
But God expects us to still live up to the standard regardless.
Yeah. Yeah, we've told ours over and over, there's no perfect parents, so we made mistakes. Y'all are going to make mistakes. Just know that we did our best. So appreciate all the comments. We'll pick up with master slaves, and we'll get into the armor of God, and that'll be the final lesson.